Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
I truly believe today we're going to talk about something that you've always had questions about and never were able to ask those questions. And it really is part of our history, part of our culture, and so much more. We're going to talk with two noted archaeologists today who have been working for decades, 5, in fact, and just fascinating stuff we can talk about in the next 30 minutes or so. Dr. Albert Ammerman and Dr. Rebecca Ammerman join us on the program today. Welcome, guys. How are you?
Fine. How are you?
Good.
When I hear, I'm the guy that stops on the Discovery Channel when I see a dig going on. I have to find out what they're doing, how they're doing it, why they're there in the first place. I think the first question of an archaeologist I'd love to know is, how do you truly determine the age of an artifact? I know there's carbon testing and blah, blah, blah. How do you know, and how accurate is it?
Well, this is a complicated thing. It depends on the time period. If you're in time periods, then you have coins, you have all kinds of things. If you're in prehistory, I did prehistory for much of my life, then you have to rely on radiocarbon dates and other sorts of things. But then you're talking about 5,000, 6,000, 10,000, 12,000 years ago. So it becomes more kind of esoteric the further back in time. So we worked once on the earliest seafaring in the Eastern Mediterranean out to the island of Cyprus, an offshore island, 12,000 years ago. And we had to use the stone tools, which were done in this very elaborate, fine, small way, these microliths. And this was actually good, but you couldn't actually get it down to a century or something. You could only get it down to a couple hundred years. But 12,000 years was already taking it back before the time of agriculture.
Now, when you say stone tools, please explain.
Right. Well, but in this case, they were turned out to be, because there are people are voyaging, they're moving around. We actually found like 12 different kinds of stone related to cherts, flints, rhyolites, and other sorts of things, which is what we thought about, that they were using pebbles that they found on the sea, in the seabed, and being able to make them. So wherever they went, they could make these tools. And they even used their teeth to snap off the thing. They're so refined and small. They're only about ½ inch in length.
So there's small blades, sharp blades of chipped stone that were used as tools in the prehistoric period.
And trapezes and triangles and so forth. And they used them sometimes in like the equivalent of arrows as points for hunting and things like that. These are hunters and gatherers. So this is a good question, but each time period and each place has its own kind of complications.
In the classical world where I work, that is with the Greeks and Romans, we've had centuries of study of sequences of different styles of pottery, different styles of sculpture, and figurative art. And so there's a dance between the layers of soil or the stratigraphy that one finds in an excavation and the objects that are found within each layer of soil as you're going down in time. And so you use that correlation between the relative level, how far down you're going, and the types of finds that you find in it. And then you're able to often date a stratum, like a layer of earth and all the things in it, based on the types of pottery that you're finding, for example. And often all you need is a very small sherd and you can tell what it is. Specialists who've studied this for a long time. So each site has its own challenge.
Personality or challenge.
Personality and challenges. Yeah.
Do you find that sometimes you don't have to dig deep, and then sometimes you do? I mean, have you found some pretty amazing finds in like 6-12 inches of soil?
Usually not. And if we work in Rome, we can find things at 17 meters, which is 50 feet. You can have 50 meters of stratigraphy in the Volabra. in the valley between the Capitoline and Palatine. In other places, you can get at a few feet. But what I concentrate on, the work that I often do, is actually sites where they're in the water, where the modern water table has reached a point over time. It wasn't that way in the ancient world, but it's been rising for various times. When we work in Venice, when we work in Rome on the earliest things in Venice, and even when we work in the Agora of Athens. And then what we have to do is use cores before we even excavate, because it's too expensive and complicated. You make little tests, like what you do in medicine, modern medicine, when you take, the biopsies and stuff like that.
So you both have unearthed, I'm sure, thousands of artifacts over the years. Are you still amazed at the ingenuity that was there thousands of years ago, making a tool, even a sculpture, how these things were all done with very little to work with back then? Does it still amaze you?
Yes, it's true. What the things that are more interesting than the artifacts are the structures, is what they're doing, in my case, with the landscape. That people in Roman times, say 700 BC, can be actually changing the way the landscape is to make it more useful for their way of living and so forth. So, and we have the case in the Forum of Rome, where they filled in a deep basin which was seasonally flooded by the Tiber. They used 10,000 cubic meters of soil to fill it in, which took a huge amount of work and planning and organization, and they turned it into the Forum. And this was something that I discovered in 1990, which changed the whole idea, because before that, there was the idea that it was very simple society. People were living separately in villages on hills. And all of a sudden, we realized that the Romans, to make a civic center where they could do all kinds of activities, had gone to this huge trouble to sort of reshape the whole landscape. So this is often, we're not interested in the tools themselves, at least in my case. And when later on at the end, we can talk about the work we do at Paestum, where my wife was invited by the person who's the director of the archaeological park at Paestum. This is a Greek site as it began, a Greek city-state, about 600 BCE. And there are 3 standing temples, not reconstructed. They're still standing there today. And she had the good fortune to have the chance to excavate after 60 years. There hadn't been any excavation. And she wanted to excavate there. He proposed that she have the excavation, and he wanted to see what we could learn if we used modern contemporary techniques, that is, more innovative archaeology than people had 60 years ago. And then this turned out to be a perfect example, because we found an artificial mound made of masses of travertine, which they had put there to make this thing into what was a visible thing of white rock that you could see for kilometers away, even out at sea. It was like a beacon of light. And so this is just the same thing. In the case of Paestum, it's an area of travertine, which is flat as a pancake. So they wanted to make an artificial hill to do something more interesting. The Greeks, this is about 500 years before Christ, are actually making this temple, and then around it on 3 sides, they make this mound about 8 or 9 feet high that slopes off. And then this creates what's called the sanctuary around the temple and so forth. So this is the sort of thing we do.
What I would like to add on that is that much of the classical archaeology has always focused on the architectural monuments that you see above ground, or the works of art, because it grew out of an art historical interest in collecting these kinds of objects that began in the Renaissance and continued on. And what Albert is able to do is to add the environmental landscape piece to that investigation. And it gives us a much better idea about the ingenuity of ancient humans in shaping their own environment. Okay. And wow. So that's what we're doing. So there's the jewel of the temple that's quite innovative, called the Temple of Athena now, But what was not fully recognized was that there was a great deal of labor that went into preparing the site on which that temple was raised. So
I find it interesting that you both work in the same field. And to me, one handles the larger landscape, if you will, and then the other part of the couple, the two of you, handles the smaller artifacts. Am I
exactly right? You're exactly right. This is
Interesting.
complementary.
Right.
We
Right.
had the good fortune to have this. See, I brought this experience. She's invited to do this. And so I designed the field work, essentially, which leads to being able to we found this mound. And the finding of the moon, this is a nice short story, which is entertaining, because no one knew whether there was a hill or there was an artificial mound.
the general thought was that it was on the high point of the landscape.
It was on the high point, but nobody knew. So what happened is, one time I'm just taking a break and they're doing prospection with ground penetrating radar to begin the work. And I'm sitting at the Bar Museo and I'm looking across. And fortunately, there's a fence which has horizontal bars in it. And when I look across through these trees where it's almost impossible to see the site, all of a sudden, it's like graph paper. I could see that it was a mound.
An artificial mound.
An artificial
Everyone
mound.
saw that it's at the high point of the site. But the curvature of the mound is not a natural curve.
And it's not so easy to see when you walk out there, because you have these there's an archaeological park that was created in the 50s. And now these trees are enormous. They cast all these shadows. You can't see. You have to sit back at a distance, having coffee, not really knowing what you're doing, with no particular idea if you're trying to figure it out. And then all of a sudden you look at it and you use the fence as the graph paper. And then you realize that it's going up and it's coming down. And this is quite substantial. And so then we had the hypothesis that this is artificial. And then we had to document that in a whole series of steps. And so this is how one does archaeology. And it's sort of looking at the situation with fresh eyes that makes it possible to do.
The original project was really to do the first systematic modern archaeological investigation of this large area called the Northern Urban Sanctuary, where this temple has been constructed. And so we had a more traditional set of objectives to try to get that stratigraphic history, to recover the various artifacts, try to understand how that part of the ancient city developed into the sanctuary that it was, because I had been studying some 10,000 fragments of terracotta figurines that had been found in excavations in the 20s, 30s, and 50s from digs that are virtually undocumented, and trying to make sense of what gods were being worshipped, what kinds of social needs the cult responded to in the local population. But we really needed some checks in the ground if we could find them. And so I turned to Albert because of his various multiple decades of field experience. And so we had begun doing the non-invasive work of ground penetrating radars and starting to think about doing the cores that he's an expert in. And we were doing just that very first season of work of running over the landscape with a machine that looks like a lawnmower, but it's sending down radar. And that was where he was taking a coffee break and had this, eureka moment. And then we modified to a certain extent, or added on to our research plan, the idea to test this hypothesis that the temple was in fact built on an artificial mound to raise it up on the landscape.
Wow. It's mind-blowing. It really is. How about human artifacts? What's the protocol? What is the way to interpret age, all of that?
Well, this depends on the country, and is very complicated. In Greece, in Cyprus, in Italy, each country and even different levels of archaeology have their things. So then you have to be very sensitive as an archaeologist and work in collaboration with them. Like many times, both when I worked in Cyprus, when I worked in Rome, I was actually working for the Italian government, not even the superintendency. And when I worked in Venice, I was working with these people. And what happens, it's a kind of joint venture where you're sharing. And then it's much easier to do. this is what, if you can get in the position that I was in, where they come and invite me, and then I treat them not as like, it's like a colonial American, but as people which are at the same level and so forth, then this actually works much better. But if we go back to this pestum, we have the mound. If you're an archaeologist, what's of great interest is not digging the mound, because this is just a bunch of rocks. It's a pile of rocks, and it will take 6 to 8 times cuts to take all the rocks away. What you're interested in is the buried landscape under the mound. It's been sitting there for 2,500 years. And if you can get down there, you have the chance to find pottery. You have the chance to find bones from sacrificed animals, horn cores of sheep and goats and cattle and so forth. And so this is the thing. We spent a huge amount of time and effort digging the mound, as one should do in a stratigraphic kind of way. And then we get down at the bottom. Now, what we did was, these were small kind of excavations, trenches. But in the future, if somebody wants to, what we found is it is great. When you get down to that buried land surface, it's full of great stuff. Pottery, bones, all of these sorts of things that they probably knew they're going to make the mound. So in preparing to do it, they made sacrifices and other sorts of things.
How did you dig it? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Well, I would just like to say that before they built the temple and prepared the artificial mound on which to build the temple around the year 500 BCE, the site was already a sacred area. And so when you get underneath the mound, you have that earliest chapter of the sacred history and activities, human activities that are on the site. And that's what the buried land surface is. It's just getting an earlier chapter of religious behavior on that site. And so that's nice, because often that earliest period is hard to reach, and hard to reach when it hasn't been already churned up by later activities.
And that was bringing me to my question. How do you get underneath the mound? Is it going straight down?
Straight down. No, but there's a better way. Once you go down and show that it's a mound and it's made of all of what we call masses. They're not blocks. They're not even worked. They're just rough and low quality things. And you might have to take a series of rock levels, like eight of them, say. And then you get down. And then you actually, you're not expecting to find too much in the mound itself, because they're building it rapidly and so forth. But the way that we do modern archaeology is that with the person whose name is Gabriel Zutrigo, he arranged that we could do 10 machine cores. Once we finished showing how to get down there, then we have a way, which is, instead of digging, you have a way you can just go straight through all the rocks and get down to the buried land surface, then what's underneath it, and then the bedrock down below. So we made 10 cores around the temple. And this is now how you would do this. It's more like modern medicine in a certain kind of way. You do like scanning, then you do the sort of testing, and you do the digging, but then also in another way, you can use big equipment at a distance of, say, 5 meters from the temple on the mound. And so you get a good sequence of the actual mound and then the buried land surface and so forth.
And you should understand that the machine-made cores can go down 8-10 meters and so forth, down to the natural bedrock of the site. And they come up with a core that's about this large. You can see, maybe 10 centimeters across. And so they give you just a little sample, very narrow, but very deep sample of the history of the site.
No, you get the sequence. You get the sequence. And then what happens is, what we decided to do when we're digging the mound is we decided to keep one by one each of the rocks that was bigger than about a foot in length, right? And then we could estimate eventually, using the sizes and numbers of these things. And when we showed how big the shape of the mound and size of it with the coring and so forth, then we could make this estimate, just a rough initial estimate of, say, 60,000 of these masses of travertine, which went into this, which was this huge labor, which was probably done in part by the local communities.
So I'm curious with these cores that you dug out. Are they a series of them that size, as you said, Rebecca? Or once you've cored, you go bigger?
About 5 or 6 inches in diameter.
And that's it. And you can find artifacts, everything.
No. See, this is what I do with many kinds of hand cores, Dutch soil augers with percussion, coring. In Rome, we did several hundred cores of many different kinds. On the Capitoline Hill, we once had more than 40 of these big ones in every place. And then this was good for the archaeology, but we went down to 30 meters. 30 meters is like 100 feet. And we had all this geology. So I had to bring in an old friend of mine, Walter Alvarez, who Walter, with his father, Luis Alvarez, a Nobel Prize winner in physics, had been, they were the two that discovered the idea of the extinction of dinosaurs by an impact event from outer space.
The meteor around the Gulf of Mexico.
This whole thing in the Ice Age films, right? You have this, this explosion. So Walter and I had been friends since the 70s in Rome. And his career went one way, and he discovered how the dinosaurs disappeared. And I was doing other things in Rome. And then at one point, I needed a good geologist and his team of people and graduate students. And so I brought him to the Capitoline Hill. And then we had 3 or 4 archaeologists and 3 or 4 geologists all working on the equivalent of, if each core is at 30 meters times 40 cores, this is a lot of meters of cores to study. And then this led to not only being able to date it by argon, the geology, which was new at Berkeley. So this was a breakthrough. But we could actually find that there was another one of these landscape transformations, which I'm not going to go into the detail, on one of the corners where the Temple of Jupiter, the most important temple in Rome, was on the top of the Capitolium, the southern summit. And so this work of making those cores then led to another kind of breakthrough in how the Romans could actually dig down in the soil because they couldn't have strong enough support to get hard volcanic rocks. And then they moved equivalent of about 1,000 cubic meters to the northwest corner to create the platform for the thing. This was about 2,600 years ago.
It's just amazing. And to me, those cores of, I want to say only that big, sounds like you keep by and large, the integrity of the mound intact. You're just kind of going, like you said, like a biopsy, on your skin. We're just going in here, getting a little piece here. We're going to analyze it. Sometimes they go deep. It sounds like what you're doing. I at one point I thought that, how are they going to get all those artifacts and all the everything? But I guess a series of cores will produce that after time.
Yeah, what the idea now is to be less invasive.
Right.
And so it's more like the model of modern medicine. I mean, medicine once upon a time too was more invasive with surgery. Can you imagine the time of the Civil War? What kind of, they'd be cutting you all up to find. And the thing is, so what in archaeology, both from the point of view of cultural heritage, not damaging the whole thing so much, but also from the efficiency, because what you want to do is in a stepwise way, lead the excavation, the work, without doing so much big excavations, because that produces huge amounts of finds, but then there's no storage room for them. There's no way to study them. So in archaeology, as it's being done today in the most advanced way, you're actually using the corings to find the stuff before you dig. You don't dig blindly. When we dig in Venice, we already know. We can even date it before they do the excavations, because you have wood in Venice, which is preserved in the water and so forth. So we do the cores, but very small ones, even about only 2 or 3 inches in diameter. Then we can date the wood at Oxford. And so we have an idea, it already dates to around 700 AD. before they even dig. And so this is actually making it. And when you do this at a site, the first site that we did this is called San Lorenzo di Castello in Venice. And so what happens is you make 10 cores, and then you decide where's the best place to go, where's the best place to dig. And so you don't dig blindly. And in the case of Rome, when you dig down, you let the cores help you guide the excavation down. So this is it's a different kind of idea of archaeology than the Indiana Jones or the person interested in artifacts and so forth, because what we need to do is have a methodology which is more appropriate and uses the tools that we have in our time.
What's I find fascinating, and my takeaway today, and there's so much to talk about. Like we could keep going on the different projects and the water projects, and even back to Greece, is that nowadays it's very controlled. You're not just, well, I think we got something over there. No, it's very controlled. You guys are like the power, not like you are the power couple of archaeology. Fascinating talking with you both. Final question. We're out of time, but I got to ask this question. Did you meet over a dig? Like, how did you guys meet? Were you archaeologists when you met?
My wife will answer this question. This is a great story. Quickly, though.
Yes. Well, I was working on my graduate doctoral research in the tip of the toe of Italy, in a town called Reggio Calabria, in the Archaeological Museum, in the basement of that building. I'd been there about 9 months, and there had been 4 archaeologists that weren't Italian that had come through. And the then director of the museum had always called me in to help find a language with which we could communicate. So someone had come from France, someone from the Netherlands, someone from Japan. And then one day the director called me up and said, there's an American coming, this Albert Ammerman. Do you know this professor? And I said, no, I've never heard of him, but I'll be available. Call me when he comes. I'll come up and I can help translate. So I got the call. I went up to the top of the building from the basement. I met Albert, and he didn't need anyone to translate for him. His Italian was just fine. Usually I invited these poor souls out for a sandwich or lunch afterwards, because they were always a little bit in shell shock. It was difficult to travel in those times, and they weren't used to having everything not quite ready for them, and their time. So I would always say, oh, you're going to Sicily, let me call ahead. Let's have lunch. So I was going to ask him for lunch. And before I could say so, he said, would you like to go out for lunch? And I said, oh, yes. He said, well, let's go to such and such. Well, it was the best restaurant in town. So I said, I'd love to, but I have to change first out of my, excavation clothes. So we met that way, and he knew Italy as well, or better than I.
He knew that restaurant was a good restaurant. Come on.
He knew it was a good way to make an impression. And he waited for me to take off my, my jeans and,
right.
dirty stuff.
He's an archaeologist. He did the research. Guys, fantastic talking with you, Albert and Rebecca. So many stories that we could go into possibly in the future. I want to ask, is there a way, if anybody has questions, they want to look at some of your work, a website that they can go to?
Yeah, there actually is. If you want to go to a website, I have a website on Marquise Who's Who.
Gotcha.
And there are there's galleries of photographs. There's probably how you can get my email address. We even have a small company called Inside Archaeology, which we can take 5 or 6 couples to visit Venice and Paestum and have good cuisine and do it with the archaeologists. It's called Inside Archaeology.
Wow.
So, but we don't want to take big groups, and we want to take people who have some travel experience in Italy and so forth. And so we've done this, and this is a way that we can help support the field work, because sometimes it's very expensive.
Wow, what a wonderful idea. It's like you're going on a retreat. It's you're getting to see history in the making. Amazing. Both of you, thank you so much for being here today. Truly appreciate all the stories, and look forward next time we might get a chance to talk.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. We'll be right back.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
Day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
Mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house. And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned.
This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.